Okay. Everyone, hi all. Thank you so much for joining us. Thrilled to see a full room here for this panel on building a decentralized identity foundation. And before we get into the actual panel discussion, an announcement.
Great. We can get the slides.
Maybe I say it again.
We have slides.
They're there?
Oh, they are?
Oh, I can't see them down here. All right, so I have no idea what slide it's on, but I guess I can just walk down and talk to you. Okay, there we go. Now I know. All right, so my name is Daniel Buckner. I work at Microsoft. Been working on concepts for decentralized identity for some time now, going way back to my stint at Mozilla. Was inspired to do it and had the opportunity to go to Microsoft and make it real. So what we're announcing today is the Decentralized Identity Foundation. It's a group of like-minded companies, people, and individuals from across the spectrum that are engaged to build a decentralized identity system that's cross-chain and open source. We know the only way to do this is to join hands with these folks. We all have the same intents and collaborative ideas. We want to make identity real for people, organizations, and devices. And I think the thing that I'm most excited about here is not only the commercial opportunities it opens up, but the fact that it's actually going to be good for people. So we believe identity needs a reboot. And here's some reasons why. You know, all the addresses and identifiers you use today, Twitter, email, all that stuff, and the places you store data storage providers and applications, are really owned and controlled by central actors and trusted authorities. I think we can do better. We believe that your data is just that, yours, and that the identity system you use to manage your identity should answer to no one but you. So what are we actually building here? Well, the technical foundation of this is decentralized identifiers linked to off-chain zero-trust data stores that give you a web of intended public data that can be the substrate for decentralized apps and services. And that's what we're engaged in Diff to build. Wayne will talk a little bit about why the blockchain.
Thanks, Dan. So, hi, everybody. My name's Wayne. So why the blockchain? Well, identity's had problems for many, many years, and we can't go into all those problems right now. But the thing that blockchain provides that's different is a secure root of trust that is not controlled by any individual person. So things like Bitcoin and Ethereum, these are robust networks that are out in the world. There's many actors who contribute to supporting them both economically and technically, and to shut them down is extremely difficult. So let me get to the right slide. So that's what the blockchain brings. So what we're doing is we've brought together 18 companies, and we have a few more that are interested in joining, like the Linux Foundation has just talked to us this morning about joining the organization. We're all competitors in some sense, but we recognize that our real competition is the status quo. If we don't work together and do something, the things that exist in the world today will just continue to exist. So what we've decided to do is to bring all of our technology together in 3 key areas and create open source projects, publish that source code, and be able to work with standards organizations like the W3C and the IETF to actually bring these things to standardization when the time comes. So that's basically what everything is about with Diff, and we're going to talk a little bit more, but if you want to learn more about Diff and are interested in joining, you can visit identity.foundation.com. Thanks.
Oh, just Identity Foundation.
Oh, I forgot. Identity.foundation.
Okay.
.com was taken, so you know.
Wonderful, thank you. So jumping quickly into a panel discussion to explore that further. And you've touched upon this a little bit, but the Diff is a nonprofit, and yet each of you guys individually represent for-profit companies and potential competitors. Why the collaborative approach? Why do you believe this needs to be housed in a foundation? And then what is the long-term business proposition for each of you as an individual company on top of this? Reuven, do you want to take it away?
Sure. As Wayne already mentioned, it's a huge topic, huge challenge. I think we all agreed that we need to partner together. We don't believe that there will be one company who will rule all of this. We really believe in open standards because like the customers demand this, clients demand, they want to avoid any vendor lock-in, and we want to avoid that, I don't know, you end up in an AOL situation where you have one browser with one email address which you can use. We really want to build an open network and an open standard, so using a browser or an email client with any of the ones, I think that's really what we want to avoid, what we want to build. And what we want to avoid is that you have fragmentation again into like reputation, because the whole ecosystem is not there yet, so we really believe that we need to build an ecosystem so every of us are talking to different countries, cities, organizations, and we really want to build something which works across different blockchains, across different sectors and countries. And I think we all represent different technologies as our basis. So we're working on Ethereum, others built on other permissioned or permissionless environments. And I think everybody will have an edge, I think, later to provide certain values. My name is Ruben Heck. I work at Consensus, and I'm leading the UPort project, which is the digital identity project within the Consensus team. And we are focusing on Ethereum, as I mentioned.
I figured we would just sort of introduce ourselves as we go. Anyone else want to pile in on that?
Hi, I'm Ryan from Blockstack, and we're building a platform for decentralized applications. And I would say it's very fortunate that the internet started out with a decentralized communication protocol, that we were able to use email from the very early days. And if you think about it, almost all of our accounts on the internet are tied in some way to our email address. And if we didn't have that, if instead we had something that was completely owned by AOL, for example, then we would have, it's very possible that the internet wouldn't have grown out in the way that it did. We wouldn't have had quite the level of innovation. We wouldn't have had the internet wouldn't have been as pervasive and impactful on our lives. And I think the same thing can be said about, not just about a communication system and protocol like email, but also about identity and about, and that's many different aspects of the person's identity. So just like with email, anyone could host their own email server. Anyone could become a business that's built on top of this decentralized communication network. That needs to exist for identity. And I think that's why it's so important for all of us to work together and to be interoperable and operate on that same decentralized identity network.
So you guys talk about this as like the necessity of collaboration and the sort of building that critical mass. Where are you relative to that tipping point of having the critical mass that you need?
We're at the very beginning. It's a very early industry. And so we're coming together to all of us have built some technology independently of each other. So what we're really doing is taking pieces, components of everything that we've built independently and said, okay, where's some overlap? What things are in common? How can we make this stuff all work together? And so we're going to be doing that in 3 open source projects and putting those out to the world so that they can do pull requests and make contributions and do all those kinds of things. And those 3 projects are around namings and identifiers, something called attestations, which is like issuing credentials, like a diploma, and then hubs, which is a secure shared data store, which Dan can talk a little bit more about later. But we're at the very beginning. We're contributing all this technology together, and many of us are, everybody on the stage is involved heavily with the normal standards organizations. And so it'll be taking it from this, we're doing an engineering first approach, and then we're going to take things and incorporate the best practices that we've learned from all the standards organizations, things like verifiable claims and DIDs and names and all these types of technologies, putting it together and putting it out to the world, and then hopefully it will be the beginning of something taking off that gets adoption.
Dan, do you want to talk about some of the technical elements?
Yeah. So, inside of these 3 technical working groups, there are these major deliverables. In the names and identifiers space, the idea that you have these sort of amorphous identifiers that don't link and leak personal data, which then can have layered on top of them friendlier names that are easier for people to grok in certain UI situations. One of the other things we're doing, like Wayne alluded to, is building out this thing we call identity hubs just internally at Microsoft. And what it really is a provider-agnostic data store that trusts no one by default. So signed at the edge, data is put in these data stores, and you would have multiple across multiple providers. We're happy to be speaking with IBM possibly about doing this. and a few other key individuals, but really your data store would live on places like IBM, Microsoft, Google, all these providers, and it syncs master to master. So it's essentially a replicated personal mesh, and that's the foundation of your data storage.
Great. And other sort of technical elements, design principles that are sort of core to the project and core to the collaboration?
Yeah, I mean, building off of what Daniel said, if we can help people control their identity with their keys and control their data and control their reputation, then we have a system. We can move to a system where the user, the individual, is at the center instead of a system where Facebook and Google are at the center. You can imagine all these different applications where you log in with Facebook. Everything is completely dependent on that platform. But if you put the user at the center, then you can unlock so many more things. You can unlock a lot more potential, and you can have a system where, for example, you have your ratings on Airbnb, but maybe it doesn't go with you when you go to HomeAway, right? That is very problematic for innovation. It's very problematic for giving consumers the best possible experience. And this is an unknown that we haven't charted yet. We don't even know about what innovation we're missing out on because it hasn't been built yet. So if we can allow people to bring all these components with them and we can put the user at the center, that is the future that we're trying to unlock. And the decentralized identity, naming, storage, reputation, all of these different components are very, very critical.
Dakota, I can talk specifically about how we're going to contribute some technology.
Sure.
So, and that might help people understand how all this stuff fits together. So we've developed a platform called Chainpoint, which is a way to link data from existing systems to a transaction on the blockchain and create a timestamp proof. So we have over 1,000 customers using it, and in about a month, we are taking all of the guts for our core product, Ethereum, and releasing the entire stack as an open source tool that anybody else can run independently and used. And Microsoft is working to run one of the top level servers as part of something called the Chainpoint network. But there's an example of we're actually taking our core product and the core functionality out of it and opening it up to the community. And you might say, well, that's crazy. How do you run a business after that? And I'll just say you guys will see. But there is a plan here. But I think other people here, like Blockstack and Evernym, will be doing similar types of things with their core technology.
So by way of introduction, my name is Dakota Gruner. I run an organization called ID 2020, which aims to provide a unique digital identity to the 1.2 billion people who have no form of identification whatsoever. And what I'm struck by in all of this is that how is this technology relevant to them? How do you envision this getting out to those who currently have nothing? Drummond?
I'll take a first crack at that. So I'm Drummond Reed. I'm Chief Trust Officer of a company called Evernym that helped develop the original code base for a new public permissioned ledger called Sovrin, S-O-V-R-I-N. And one important point about the Decentralized Identity Foundation, we're all coming together to produce code that will allow for interoperable decentralized identity that's ledger neutral. It should work across the permissionless ledgers, Bitcoin, Ethereum, but also public permission ledgers like Sovrin, and private permission ledgers such as Hyperledger. The Sovrin Foundation was stood up last September, actually joined Hyperledger and has contributed the Sovrin open source code base to Hyperledger. It's now called Project Indy. And Project Indy will be producing open source code for public permission ledger. But all of these ledgers need to have an interoperable layer that will allow any person, any organization, any connected device to have decentralized identity. Now, in coming up with that architecture, the decentralized identifiers, DIDs that we talked to that are central to this, we found that even down at the level of this very simple specification for how you do decentralized identifiers, because they're controlled by cryptographic keys, we had to build in the concept of guardianship, that a person or organization that is in the position to control those keys can be a guardian for an individual, or obviously a device that's not. And we think that guardianship is a critical for infrastructure to solve the problem that Dakota's talking about how we're going to give self-sovereign identities to the quarter of this population's planet, the planet's population that does not have decentralized identity today.
Maybe to add on this, I think the third one we talked about only briefly was attestations, which is a very, I think, important concept to understand. So anyone can attest someone about a fact or some data. So I can get an attestation that I'm a client of this company, that I have done this certification, that I'm working in this company. So this can be anything. So in particular to the question, in our world, a legally issued identity is kind of the key thing, because otherwise you cannot even open a bank account. So this is something which can work well in the world where we're living. But I think the general concept is so generic that you can use attestations of any kind. So you can attest even within a village. People can start doing peer-to-peer attestations. Everybody who trusts someone else attesting this information. And so you build a web of trust. I think that's a good foundation to then reach out and get services in a digital form and build a reputation in the digital ecosystem. And this is all based on this attestation, which is one of the working groups we have.
Great. And then I guess related to the previous question, what's the path to wide-scale adoption in markets far more developed?
Yeah, I can answer some of this. So I think we really focus on this. I think one of the challenges with building a new system from scratch is that when you build it, you have an empty screen. You don't have data attached to your identity. You don't have reputation attached to your identity. So how do you make that useful in a sort of bottoms-up approach? So we work on the other end, where we're working with existing large data custodians who currently have literally millions and millions of records, but have a vested interest in connecting those records to decentralized identities. And the reason is that any one organization that has a bunch of data on an individual, it's useful, but what's really useful is connecting that data to other systems that relate to that individual, so that you can get a complete, full record and history of the individual. So we do a lot of work in healthcare, where the ultimate dream is to build total continuity of care across many different systems and many different platforms. And currently, everything is very provider-centric in terms of the data model. Your records, your data, it revolves around the provider, not around you. And really, it should revolve around you. It's your health. It is your data, and it's your life. And so there's a recognition, I think, in the industry that this model needs to change, but the technologies kind of lag behind the desire. And there's some other forcing functions that are happening, like in other countries. In the US, it's a little bit tougher because the law still doesn't necessarily reflect the ownership rights of individuals for data. But in Europe, that's changing very rapidly, especially with things like General Data Protection Regulation, which is going into effect in May of 2018, which actually asserts the data rights of the individual. They have the right to modify their data, to view it, to export it, and the right to be forgotten. And so this is creating a transformational change in the way software is being built across Europe, but it's also going to have tentacle effects in the United States.
I really appreciate that Micah brought up the healthcare industry. I think it actually highlights a piece of the technical foundation of this. So these hubs, one interesting realization we had was looking at companies and industries like healthcare that already have common ways they represent data. So for healthcare, it's a lot of them do HL7 FHIR. So they have these semantic structures, and in some efforts past with personal data stores and things like it, they would come up with their own ontologies, or they'd try and force some syntactical sugar on you, or you'd have to convert everything that you had. And one of the key pieces of these hubs that we wanted to build in from the start was the idea that you bring the data that you have in the schema and the standards that are present in your industry. So there's sort of this inferred API. You never have to go look up the docs to understand how to get like a medical device object, because the pathing is based one-to-one on the schema that you're writing to, which, it sounds so simple, but it actually was going to let organizations and you as a person receiving healthcare interoperate regardless of what plan you switch to or job you take that has a different healthcare plan. And I think that's a huge interoperability piece that we're trying to build in from the foundation.
Yeah, and some of the most innovative areas right now are actually in the Scandinavian countries. They have a grassroots effort called My Data, which is actually trying to really flip that model. And they're trying to do it in a very broad way where many, many service providers are switching the model to this user-centric data. And so they're a really hot test bed for this type of thinking. And that's a grassroots effort, and the government is completely behind it. And so I think you're going to see some of this innovation popping up in other markets outside of the US first. but it'll serve as a really good model for us to bring it here.
So this brings up a wonderful question that comes up frequently around decentralized or self-sovereign identity, which is, wait a minute, what about governmental identity and EID systems and systems like ADHAR that has enrolled more identities than anything else in the history of the planet? So I want to tell you a story about attending the Blockchain Roadmap for Austria conference 2 weeks ago in Vienna, where 70 people got together to help create a roadmap for the Austrian government for the use of the blockchain. Austria wants to be the Estonia of blockchain. So 5 subgroups, the 70 people broke into 5 subgroups, one of which was identity. And the identity group came out with 2 very, very clear recommendations. The first one was that, in fact, self-sovereign identity, precisely what we are building here, was the best way for Austrian companies to comply with the GDPR regulations. That, in fact, it makes things like consent, the right to be forgotten, data minimization, pseudonymization, all much easier, both for the companies and for the individuals. The second one was particularly eye-opening. The recommendation was that the Austrian government should issue a self-sovereign identity card. So that, in fact, it's not, I mean, they can make it an actual card, but it's really an attestation from the Austrian government that you are a citizen of Austria that you can use as part of your self-sovereign identity, which really highlights something that Dakota has discussed with all of us here, this term self-sovereign identity you hear a lot. Well, is that inherently in opposition to governments? Well, I think the story I just told you is exactly the opposite. They are going to be best friends. A self-sovereign identity is actually going to help governmental identity systems. At the European Identity Conference, we talked about the struggles the German identity card, one of the best designed in the world, has had with adoption. There's so many regulations and restrictions around using it that if they can just make an attestation to you as an individual, your self-sovereign identity, that you're a German citizen, that you have that card, it's going to open it up. And many things, we're going to talk about a real web of trust, just like, the same economic potential that the web unleashed.
So I hear the point you're making about Austria, which is clearly sort of ahead of the curve on this. But for governments that are grounded in the notion of them being the issuers of identity, right? It's potentially an incorrect sort of view of the term, but how can you help them understand something when you've got a term that seems sort of directly in conflict?
I think one way is that we show by example, right? We build these systems into existing systems that they may use in their enterprises. Like, there's some, I'm pretty sure they probably run a lot of Microsoft tools. So it'll get them acclimated with the fact that this is just another transactional method of storing your identity data securely. And these things, these attestations, permits, whatever you want to call them, are essentially just the government codifying into digital terms the aspects about you that they are willing to represent. And so that shouldn't be any fear, right? They control who they make these attestations about. That's 100% in their sphere of authority. This just gives them a way to do it in a way that's more secure and gives the individual back more power.
Yeah, well, I think there's a language issue too, because the government doesn't create an identity. The last I checked, governments don't actually give birth to people, right? Your identity is formed when you're born, and that's who you are. What governments actually do is they create an attestation that you are a citizen of their country, and that you have these certain attributes that they can verify, and that's it. And that's all we're talking about. We're saying your identity belongs to you. It is self-sovereign. You can create it. It is yours. But you can still have issuing bodies, make certifications and attestations about you that are certified, signed digitally, so that it can be verified. And so you can go to a bar and swipe something, and it still shows up that you're over 21.
Yeah, I would like to emphasize that it's not only about the legal identities. I think really we all have so much data already in our digital life. So we're producing so much data with Facebook, Google, and others. So the main idea is if we give this power back to the users, they will already now build a reputation just by using normal internet services. So if you're an Uber driver or an Airbnb, whatever it is, and you can start collecting and building a reputation digital, that doesn't need to be even a legal identity. And you can use this to use other services, and I think that would be already very powerful. And over time, to, let's say, fake one of these identities will be harder than to fake a passport or something else.
Yeah,
so that's, I think, a really big point.
But yeah, the vision here is that the user gets to create their own identity core, right? And then instead of Uber locking up their ratings about you in their system, it gets attached to your identity core. Your Airbnb ratings get attached to your identity core. HomeAway, Lyft, right? Your United States, the United States Passport Authority has the ability to attest to you. And then you have your own state. So you're combining your passport, your driver's license. Maybe you have another citizenship somewhere else. Maybe you have your friends who are issuing you attestations like they can do on LinkedIn. So it's governments, it's corporations, it's peers. Everything goes around your identity core, and you can bring it with you wherever you want. And then that should be able to unlock a lot more
Let me
potential.
offer like a story that you asked a question about how do we get this stuff mainstream. Let me talk about a hypothetical scenario. So my wife is a nurse, and we moved from the East Coast to California about 6 months ago. And in doing so, she had to transfer her nursing license and all of her credentials. And it took her about like 3 or 4 weeks to do it. She had to talk to like 6 different companies. I think she told me she paid about $270 just to get all these credentials transferred over. Now, look at a company like Microsoft. They acquired LinkedIn. Now, LinkedIn has 550 million profiles in it. And in those profiles, you have basically your work history and your educational credentials. Well, imagine a scenario where my wife's LinkedIn profile, all the credentials for her nursing license would be inside that LinkedIn profile, and that they were cryptographically verifiable in a way that all these intermediaries that she had to pay and fill out paperwork and fax things to would just be able to go away. And now Microsoft, who's a business who needs to earn money, would have an incentive to use this technology to make it easier for my wife to be able to verify her credentials as a nurse, and also could use that as part of their business. Now, that's just a hypothetical scenario, but what's really blocking it is there aren't standards on how to do this. There aren't standards on how to issue the credentials. There isn't a canonical registry in the sky that says this is where Carolyn Vaughn information is available, and it's been digitally signed with a digital signature for her. And there isn't a mechanism to be able to prove the verification of those credentials. And those are pieces that we all bring together as individual companies, and we're going to be putting them into one big pot, and we're going to see what the world can bring for it. But
to second your point there on the registry, so that's a huge pain point in healthcare, is actually provider information, provider credentialing. Everybody's keeping and maintaining their own separate record of who's got what credentials, and then they're trying to reconcile back and forth, and that costs the industry literally billions and billions of dollars on a problem that we could actually solve. So there's really, really tangible, low-hanging fruit use cases for this technology that could be applied directly right now.
So one thing, maybe I'll talk about a future state a little bit, something that's a little farther out there. By the way, Wayne, that's a fantastic idea about LinkedIn. I'll have to talk to someone about that.
call me.
Yeah, go ahead. So I want you to imagine another thing that this identity system can do, things that are well outside the bounds of just attestations. I give this example a lot to people in talks. So if you think about how you do secondhand sales right now in the United States, and maybe it's different in other countries, there's this company called Craigslist, and it's predominantly the way you put up your red couch or your silver car that you're selling. And what you do is you go on the Craigslist website and you put in all this data in there for them, and then it goes into the Craigslist blockchain, which happens to just be a server that they own, which is a centralized, walled garden. What if in the future there was a highly addressable and understood path for things like offer objects? Maybe it was a schema.org offer object. And it was just kind of understood, and it already is in some contexts, that that's going to be the way the offers are represented. So you can put up in your Identity Hub maybe a plain text version of an offer that you want to be public, intended public data. And you might have crawlers running through this large index of IDs at a high rate of speed, and they're looking for very specific things. For instance, it could be, a Bing local shopping tab. And we could form up the same view of Craigslist, but we don't require you to come to us. In fact, it democratizes application development in the sense that anyone can crawl for that data and anyone can represent a view that looks a lot like Craigslist. Why? Because it's discoverable and people know where to find it. And I think that's one of the huge pieces on the app and service side that we haven't talked a little about yet, and it's a little farther out, but interesting nonetheless.
I think Drummond, you want to get in here.
I just want to make sure, first of all, that it is a very exciting vision for how that gets democratized. Privacy. How many of you are sitting out there in that audience thinking, oh, this means I'm putting all my identity data out on a blockchain? All
That
right.
guy.
3 things we've learned about blockchain, decentralized self-sovereign identity. First one is you don't put private data on the chain. You put public data on the chain. And if you want to see what that data looks like, the specifications we're talking about, the base layer, this DID, decentralized identifier, Google the DID family of specifications. Okay, the DID family of specifications, I checked it just before coming in here. It will take you right to the GitHub page that has a document that summarizes all of them. You can link off to them. So what we've learned about is, first of all, contrary to expectation, you won't have a single identity out there. You will have as many DIDs as you need to keep your data contextually private and separate. Potentially a separate one for every single, for instance, company you have a relationship with, or every person you have a relationship with, okay? Second thing is, you don't put the private data on the ledger. You keep that in your hub behind the access control that you want. So even if they talk about putting encrypted data on the ledger, well, if that encryption's broken, that's public forever. So that's the second thing. The third one, which I'm particularly bullish on, you've heard in several sessions here all about how privacy, even with Bitcoin that's designed for it, doesn't really have the anonymity it was designed for. And now zero-knowledge proof technology is being used to apply that. Well, with the kind of infrastructure we're looking at, particularly I'm speaking for the sovereign network here, I can't speak for the others, is that all the claims you need to share you can do with zero-knowledge proofs. So if I'm given a driver's license as a credential, for instance, from the Washington state government, I will be able to share just that I'm over 21. Okay, if I need to go to a bar, I don't have to share my age. I don't have to share everything else that's on that driver's license. Imagine now with this infrastructure that we can use zero-knowledge proofs for all of the information we're sharing. It becomes the default out there. This, I would submit, is a renaissance for privacy on the internet. That's the import of what we're doing here.
I think it's also, to your question, like the path to adoption, I think data is an asset for many companies, but it's also a liability for others. So if we can achieve now that you have this one-click shopping experience, and in this one click you give everything which is relevant in terms of your address, your credit card, or other ways, and encrypt it, potentially even to just the logistics company, maybe not even to the shop. So there's a lot of things we can do completely different and really get back and remove the liability for companies. And not only in Europe, I think it's a general trend in the market, given all these hacks.
Yeah, a big thing that we're collaborating on is a discovery system across blockchains for the identities themselves. A big component of that is the DID, decentralized identifiers. Another component is the blockchain name system, which allows for domain names essentially or usernames that users control and can exist on any blockchain that you want. That's something that we've also been collaborating upon. There's been tens to hundreds of thousands of domain names for users already registered, and we're working together to make sure that there are drivers that will allow you to work on the Bitcoin blockchain, Ethereum blockchain, the sovereign blockchain, all of the different blockchains. And it's important that you're able to just type in someone's either full name or their username into any application that you're using, and be able to find the person that you want, or be able to visit their profile, be able to send them a direct message, for example, on any of these applications. This is a very critical component.
I mean, one way to think about that, now, to marry the two, the name layer, the DIDs, is that DIDs are, not contested, so they're kind of just these, again, amorphous strings that have a purpose, and that is to retain anonymity for you and to secure your privacy. The name layer comes on top, so you might have multiple names associated with the DID, and that allows you to shadow different versions of yourself and have people find different versions of yourself. So they're really, really actually very important, and they work together well, and we're trying to make sure that's the case.
I guess one question to layer on top of that, to what extent is it also then important to establish the biological uniqueness of the person under the DID, and how would you go about thinking about that?
I mean, why don't I tee that up for Drummond? He's probably...
Well, I mean, don't look at me as the biometric expert. However, every time we talk about self-sovereign identity, it comes up. Well, your strongest proof of that, of course, is your biometrics. Most folks would turn around and go, it's also the most dangerous form of proof, because if it's stolen, it's gone forever.
You only get one.
And you only get one. Yeah. Yes, short of some certain sci-fi movies that have been popular recently. So privacy-respecting biometrics are a huge area of research. I know Evernym's particularly interested in them, and one company that's working specifically on the refugee and at-risk population is saying if you are a refugee, if you have literally no device, no way, and not even the ability to keep a piece of paper, then you need to have a way of using your biometrics to claim and reclaim, potentially in another country, a self-sovereign identity, but do it without the capability that those can be stolen. It's not an easy problem. We are working on it, particularly with zero-knowledge proofs, and I'm optimistic.
I think we've spoken in the very beginning about like the scope. We talked about mainly now human identities. I think I just want to broaden it up. I think what we are working on is really like IoT and other things. So in the upcoming future where we're all working on is like all devices, everything, your car, your door lock, everything will have some form of identity because you need to build a relationship between I'm the owner of this apartment and I delegate access to this one to the tenant. And all of these relationships will be extremely important in this new digital ecosystem. So digital identity is really like a very broad one. And so I think the scope of all the naming, DID, and everything is really broader than just humans.
Ruben, I like that you brought up devices. That it's one thing, it's another topic where you can kind of expand your mind. Like we talk about kind of the last mile, the end state, where you receive this device, and yes, maybe it has a TPM, some sort of chip inside that has its keys, and it can prove that it's a distinct identity. But actually, that object's identity begins in the factory. This identity system also provides an excellent substrate for things like supply chain. You might know every bolt and every piece and every worker that touched that object, every relay point when it was handed off from the factory to the ship, to when it was receiving and when it went to distribution. And in that way, it carries that lineage over the same system. So we're not selling you these isolated systems that do one or two pieces of functionality. We're selling you a total system that begins at the formation of anything as a noun.
And those devices are going to feed. Sorry, we're excited about machines.
1, 2, 3. How about that?
Those devices are going to be spouting out a huge quantity of data as well that's going to be used in lots of downstream applications. So there's this whole digital supply chain that's being built around the data streaming off of IoT. And by the time it gets to that end consumer, you need to make some very strong guarantees about the integrity of that data. And so everything that can stream off that machine needs to be identified, it needs to be signed, and you need to know its origin and source and be able to prove that before you use it in a downstream application. So this identity framework applies there too.
I would go so far as saying there's no solution for the identity of things that doesn't also have to account for the identity of people and organizations, and vice versa. Things don't act on their own, right? And if you don't actually have that legal provenance for an authorization for the data, then any systems developed independently are just going to continue to clash.
But I want to touch on another aspect of this, which is the data security aspect, which is it's really dangerous when we have all this data that's stored and all these identity credentials that are stored in centralized databases, and we're seeing so many different hacks and account breaches and attacks like the WannaCrypt attack that happened recently. And a lot of this gets a lot more dangerous and consequential when we have everything stored in these centralized silos. So if we can push all the data to the edges, if we can push the identity to the edges, to the users, to the devices, we can be a lot more resilient. We can avoid we can still recover data if some attacker encrypted all of our hospital's medical records. The data can be recovered, and the hospital can resume its operations. Yeah. So that's a very, very important part of this. And the internet is actually getting way more dangerous than it's ever been before. So this is a huge, very powerful forcing function for this to happen. I see this as an inevitability, and all of us together, we're building these systems to be interoperable so that we can actually make this happen.
So Drummond said something a few moments ago that's true today, but won't be true tomorrow. He said things don't do things on their own. So one of my friends has a self-driving car company. And one of the things that I think regulators are going to require in the future is that these autonomous vehicles have an identifier, and they regularly report data. And the integrity of that data and the origin of that data is cryptographically verified to have come from that device. So we've all seen the stupid Carfax commercials where the little fox jumps around and talks about being able to tell like the history of a car. In the future, the ability to, each car will probably have something like a Carfax built into it, if you will, the ability to issue that, here's what the odometer read, here's where a sensor reported some sort of failure, here's when went in for a service. You won't need somebody to scrape the data from the service centers and from the car's internals. It will be standardized and it will be part of the operation of that particular car, and it will be an important part, not only just making sure the car is well maintained, but if there's an accident or there's some other liability, if that thing's an autonomous vehicle, and I live in Mountain View, California, and I see about 25 self-driving cars every single day. So it's very real, and I think that's a good use case for how identity and things can match together.
So we're already over time. A very quick question. How is the diff governed? And what are the opportunities for organizations, whether technical or non-technical, to get involved?
So we want to be as absolutely open as possible. We're speaking with a number of larger companies at this point, some that are diehard competitors of ours in the blockchain space, but we recognize this is unique. This is not the same. We have to collaborate on this because it isn't. No one company is going to define this. So you can reach out to us. There's a forum on Diff. If you're interested in any capacity, we even have a working group on use cases and requirements, because after all, you can write piles of code, and if it's not actually applicable to the things that we talked about on stage and other use cases that are important to people, it's not going to go anywhere. So totally open. We want as many people under this tent as possible because this is a public utility for public good. Identity.foundation.
I also want to say
Closing comments.
there is already collaboration between Diff and the Hyperledger group. In 5 minutes, the identity working group of Hyperledger is meeting. I believe it's straight over there in the Glasgow room, something like that. Yeah. Anyway, it's right over there. If you want to dive deeper in any of this, come join us there.
Okay, we're getting kicked off. Thank you guys very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.